is ready. So Claudia is here. The author is Claudia Golden. She'll be presenting on understanding the economic impact of COVID-19 on women.
I am here and I'm just making this a bigger screen, I think. I can't make this a bigger screen, Jan. So, oh, wait, here it goes. Okay, now I can.
Looks good.
Okay, now it's going to be even better. Okay. Is that okay?
Looks great.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so the economic downturn that resulted from our COVID coma has had effects different from those of any recession in US history. This time really has been different. Never before have we needed to shut down the economy to get it running again. And never in peacetime have the caring sectors been as intertwined with the economic sectors. And never before has a recession impacted women more than men. The closing of schools and daycares, the reduction of home healthcare workers intensified the time demands on women. And even though work from home was safer, it was filled with interruptions, prompting some to cleverly dub it work from hell. It's no wonder that during the first year of the pandemic, news media and policy reports were jam-packed with alarming headlines and media echo chamber prophecies. My intention is to clarify the impact of the pandemic on women in 5 ways and answer the following questions. First of all, did we actually lose 33 years of female labor force growth, as the statement implies at the bottom? And also, what is the appropriate counterfactual or hypothetical to use to evaluate the impact of the pandemic on women, given the run-up in female labor force participation that I'll show that preceded it? Number 2, should the pandemic be deemed a she-cession, as noted here and by many? Has gender been the greatest divide in this recession? And 3, what was the increase in childcare time for working parents? And related to that, did the pandemic push mothers out of the labor force, as the headline states? Did 1 in 3 mothers actually drop out or scale back? And 5, since there are many factors that co-vary, what have been the separate effects of each? Occupation, race, ethnicity, education, and children on women's employment rates relative to men's. So let's dig in. The claim that the female labor force participation rate fell during the pandemic is not incorrect, but the implication that female labor force participation plummeted from a much higher level before the pandemic to one that was extremely low during the pandemic is highly mistaken. From April of 2019 to 2 years later in April of 2021, the decrease for women 25 to 54 years old was negative 0.4 percentage points. That for men was negative 1.4 percentage points, and I'm sorry, 0.7 percentage points for women negative, and for men negative 1.4. The female labor force participation rate in the US has been disturbingly stuck around 75% for some time. And one exception is the sharp run-up in participation that occurred just prior to the pandemic. Out of the 383 monthly figures since January 1990 to November of 2021, just 10 exceed that for January of 2020, and that's the red star. A substantial fraction of the women who entered in the period immediately preceding the pandemic left during it. and the increase was disproportionately among young, less educated women with young children. Its importance here concerns the counterfactual or the hypothetical in computing the impact of the pandemic. Differencing from January or February of 2020, as many have done, will produce larger shortfalls than differencing from a month in, say, 2019 or 2018. It will also attribute seasonal employment changes, particularly during the summer months, to the pandemic. The micro CPS data are generally not corrected for seasonality. So let's move on to number 2. Was the pandemic a she session? Women were, as we'll see, somewhat more impacted than were men, but differences by education were extremely large, still are, and less educated women and men were the most impacted. A simple way of answering the question is to use the monthly CPS to produce the fraction of the population, here 20 to 54 years old, by education and sex who were at work, or the fraction in the labor force. At work here is employment, but excludes those who had jobs but were not at work, which has become a convention in the pandemic period. I difference for each of the 7 pandemic seasons shown here from spring of 2020 to fall of 2021 from an identical season in a previous year. Although I chose to use the 2018 year, the results are not much different if I use 2019. There was a huge deficit initially, as you can see, 8 percentage points for the college graduates and 17 percentage points for the non-college graduates. And note as well that I provide the base numbers at the bottom so you can see the scale. The big differences pretty clearly are not necessarily by gender. The big differences here are by education. I'd like to make 2 more points before moving on. The first is that if I had instead difference from winter of 2020, which has been common in the literature and on which some of the statements I noted before were based, there would be greater decreases shown here as the additional faded bars. You can see it goes like this. Those are the additional faded bars for women, but generally not for men. And there is a greater increase in these faded bars during the summer months due to attributing the seasonal changes to the pandemic. The other point that I want to make is that the reason that the more educated were less impacted by the pandemic is that they could and they did work remotely. Even before vaccines were available, the more educated were effectively inoculated health-wise and job-wise. Ever since May of 2020, the monthly CPS has asked whether an individual has ever worked remotely in the past 4 weeks because of the pandemic. The fractions by sex and education given here clearly show that the more educated had a far greater ability to work remotely. Differences by gender are small relative to differences by education. In sum, differences in at work and labor force changes, which I haven't shown, but which are in the paper, between men and women existed, but were not great. And there were and still are large differences between the more and the less educated. What about childcare time? By my calculations, childcare time in March of 2020 doubled almost overnight. The calculations I provide here are for different sex parents who are college graduates, both employed, with a youngest child less than 18 years of age. For parents with an elementary school-age child, see the red oval, hours for childcare alone increased overnight from around 15 per week And the scale here is for hours of the mother, but the numbers on top of the bars are for the fraction that she did. So just divide and you'll get the total. So they increased overnight from around 15, with the mother doing around 58% before March of 2020. And they changed to around 33 a week, with the mother doing around 52% in April of 2020. Note that the fraction of the total that she did decreased, but her hours soared from just below 9 to above 17. Dads did a lot more at first, but in the fall of 2020, when work somewhat resumed and some offices, factories, and building sites opened up, but schools flickered on and off, mothers took up the slack, and their childcare hours increased to probably more than 22 a week, as did, and this is for childcare alone, as did their share of the total, which zoomed to around 70-something%, even as total childcare hours probably declined somewhat. Employed men focused more on their paid work, and employed women focused more on their childcare. My favorite photo from the New York Times series, The Primal Scream, says it all. By the way, she's on a work call. So what was the impact of children on women's outwork rates? To understand the impact of children on women's employment, I took the same differences by season for the fraction at work as I did before among women with the youngest child of the varying ages shown here. The results show once again that education mattered a lot, and that among college graduates, those with a very young child actually increased their outwork rates across the pandemic. That's in the black oval. But that was not the case for the lower educated group. In addition, even women without children, of course, had deficits in employment relative to the previous year, and that's in the red oval. But even during the hardest hit months of the pandemic, the McKinsey-Leaning claims that I showed before, that 1 in 3 mothers would leave the labor force, or 1 in 4 women would, was vastly off by a factor of somewhere between 4 and 25. So let me put it all together. To understand what matters most when gender, education, occupation, race, ethnicity, age, marital status, and the age of the youngest child are all considered, I constructed a sample of individuals here, 20 to 54 years old, who are observed in one CPS month at work or in the labor force, depending upon which one I do. Let's say at work here, and then another precisely a year later. So I have individuals who are observed in one CPS month at work, and then precisely a year later, we see what they did. They will traverse 3 pandemic phases. Some are observed only within the pre-pandemic period, from January 2018 to February of 2020. Some are observed entering the pandemic period after March of 2020, and some are observed within the pandemic from March of 2020 to November of 2021. The main effects of the regression are the pandemic phase, education, the child ages, race, and occupation, where occupation here is defined as a group of occupations, which I call service, that were impacted by state mandates that shut down businesses or limited their density. They include, for example, retail, restaurants, and various personal services. All variables are interacted with the pandemic phases. First here for women only, and in a moment, I'll show you the pooled regression for men and women. The results for at work for the pre to the pandemic phase for women are shown here. There was, as you can see, a 7 percentage point decline, which is the main effect. College cuts that more than in half. Children add to the decline, and being in one of the service occupations had disastrous consequences. Given all these factors, race mattered, and in the paper, I explore the health consequences of the pandemic as a likely reason. I next pool men and women, adding the interaction with female. The differential impact of women, the interaction of female, and the pre to pandemic phase shows the she session impact on at-work rates, but also that the college graduate women completely make up for the deficit, and that there were no differences between men and women by occupation and race, even though there were differences by children relative to men with residential children. Almost no one has been untouched by the pandemic, but much of the deepest pain was experienced by parents, particularly women, whose caregiving increased almost overnight. And yet female labor force participation rates did not plummet, and at-work rates greatly recovered for many, not all, from the initial pandemic shock. Women were stressed and frustrated, in large measure because they stayed in the labor force. They found new jobs. They persisted working in homes that were also schools and impromptu health clinics. A she session can be found, but not as much among the college educated. What about the future? Is it possible that we will emerge on the other side of darkness with benefits from our time in exile? Travel for business will be down, whoopee, and the cost of both temporal and geographic flexibility will decrease. But the new normal, that is still terra incognita. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudia. That was terrific. The first discussant is Stefania Albanese. To share your slides. You're working.
Why doesn't Jane go ahead? Because I'm having, 1 second. Okay, here we go. I think I have it. Okay, let's see. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Here we are. Never use a brand new computer for the first time in an official presentation. So thanks so much for inviting me to discuss this paper, which I think is really very helpful, particularly because, as Claudia suggested, it clarifies a bunch of statements that have been made over and over and over in the media. So let me start with this graph. So this is just the percent decline in employment by gender for the prime age population during the pandemic, so throughout 2020 and 2021, where the percentage decline is relative to the same month in 2019. And as you can see clearly here, at the height of the pandemic, the employment drop was about 4 percentage points larger for women than for men. And, you know, this was very novel because in standard recessions, as Claudia said, usually men lose more jobs than women. This is just a log variation of employment for men and women, again, prime age population, in the last 3 recessions before the pandemic recession. So starting with the 1991 recession. And you can see that in every single recession, men lose more jobs than women during the recession. So this is the entire recession plus 3 years after. And actually, so this phenomenon has been, you know, you can see it in earlier recessions as well, but it kind of became more of a well-known fact with the Great Recession, which The Economist, I think, was the first magazine to call it a man session because they realized that more men lost jobs than women in that particular recession. But historically in the United States, every recession prior to the COVID recession was a man session, if you want to use that language, which I don't particularly like. So what do we know about what happens in standard recessions to give us those kinds of facts about employment loss by gender. So there's a labor demand side and a labor supply side. On the labor demand side, it's kind of an easy explanation. So there's more men than women in the highly cyclical industries and occupations, manufacturing, construction, transportation, and so on. And then on the labor supply side, this is not a well-known fact to most macro people who think about business cycles a lot, but it is a better known fact to household economists and labor supply people and so on, which is the fact that particularly married women tend to increase their attachment to the labor force in recessions. And what you see actually is that women who would have exited the labor force had there been an expansion do not do so in a recession as a form of household insurance against the potential risk of job loss of their husband or cohabitating male partner. And so what we see in standard recession is both a labor demand force sort of leading women to lose fewer jobs and a labor supply force, which is coming mainly from the participation margin, and in particular, the employment to non-participation flow. Now, when then we go and think about what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's useful to also put on the lens of labor demand versus labor supply. And so here I'm going to review some of the results that I have in a paper with Jiyoung King and so, relate them to Claudia's finding to give a broader perspective in terms of what she talks about in her paper. So as Claudia already said, on the labor demand side, women are overrepresented in certain service occupations that were particularly exposed to the infection risk or the mandates, that were put in place. But also on the labor supply side, there was this idea that because of school closings and childcare closings and so on, mothers were saddled with childcare responsibilities. And here I put a question mark at the end of that in the sense that, this is, I think, somewhat of the dispute, in Claudia's paper. So what she shows in her paper is that, yes, mothers were at some level saddled with childcare responsibilities, but many didn't leave the workforce, particularly educated mothers who could work from home. So I want to give you a little bit more of a sense of these facts in the rest of my discussion. So first of all, I want to narrow in on, which occupations were most affected by the pandemic and what was the gender exposure to the pandemic in terms of employment loss through this lens of the occupational distribution. And so we came up with distinction between high and low contact occupations based on the distance with co-workers and customers that typical workers have to take in their jobs. And then flexible versus inflexible occupations, this dichotomy is based on whether the occupation or the job can be done remotely versus not. And so, with this distinction, we can come up with 4 occupational categories: flexible high contact, flexible low contact, and then the most relevant occupations are the inflexible ones, which cannot be done remotely, of which some are high contact, and so they require a lot of interaction with customers or co-workers, and they are mainly healthcare, personal care, and hospitality occupations. And then inflexible low contact occupations, which are production, construction, transportation, and so on, which are inflexible, but are not so subject to infection risk. And also, these are mostly the occupations that are affected by standard recessions for the most part. And in the table below, you see the distribution of men and women, prior to the pandemic across these occupations. And the inflexible high contact occupations account for 26% of all female employment, only 9% of male employment. And instead, the inflexible low contact occupations, they are very male dominated. They account for 40% of male employment, 11% of female employment. And then the flexible occupations, the one that can be done remotely, they actually are the biggest chunk of the occupational distribution. There's about more than 50%, of all workers are in fact in a flexible occupation. So that's something to keep in mind. So if we look at the change in employment by gender in each of these 4 occupational categories, so this is the graph that you see here, and all the differences are from the same month in 2019 to take account of seasonality. And this is, a very striking graph, and it sort of matches what Claudia also found as well that if we look at the flexible occupations, well, first of all, they have much, much smaller drops in employment, and there are not very big gender gaps in that change in employment. But when we go to the inflexible occupations on the high contact side, so all these service type healthcare occupations, we see that there's a really massive drop at the height of the pandemic, about 40%, and then the gender differences are relatively small. But then when we go to the inflexible low contact occupations, which are very male dominated, we see that also there's a very large drop in employment, but the drop in employment is much larger in those occupations for women than it is for men. Of course, there are fewer women in those occupations, but that is sort of notable. And so essentially we see that in this male dominated inflexible occupation, women lost way more jobs than men, but men and women lost a lot of jobs. And then in inflexible high contact occupations, both men and women lost a lot of jobs. And the occupation distribution accounts for about 1/3 of the gender differences in employment behavior over the course of the pandemic. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is sort of, okay, so that's the effect of occupation. It's coming from, a labor demand factor. So now let's control for occupation as well as age and education and see if there are any remaining disparities by gender. And so what I'm showing you is the change in the employment to unemployment flow, which is seen as sort of job loss as determined by a drop in labor demand, something that usually rises a lot in at the beginning of any recessions. And this is also by family status. So looking at whether workers are married or single and whether they have any residential children younger than 12 with them. And what you see that even once you condition on occupation, age, and education, there are still some sizable gender differences in this employment to unemployment flow, and particularly at the height of the pandemic in March to May 2020, single women lost more jobs compared to single men, and the difference is with children, and the difference is very large. And you also see that for married women compared to married men. And there's also significant gender difference in the second part of 2020. But then when we get to 2021, we still see single women with children compared to single men with children sort of being more exposed to employment loss, so employment to unemployment flows. Okay, now let's focus on labor supply. So, this is where I think Claudia does really important work, sort of focusing us on the relevance of thinking about the counterfactual, because we have this weird phenomenon where at the end of 2019, there was a mini surge in participation of actually both men and women. So what you see, this is just a labor force participation rate for prime age people as a percentage change to 24 months prior throughout 2019 to the end of 2021. And you can see that in 2019, towards the end of the year, there's this mini surge in participation, mainly for women, but to some degree also for men. They're much higher than they were, 2 years prior. And then you can actually see that the drop in participation overall is not that different for men and women, just looking at this raw data, which sort of confirms, what Claudia was saying before, that, with a counterfactual that looks further back relative to the start of the pandemic, you get less asymmetry across gender in the behavior of labor supply. Now, to get a better sense of what happened to particularly, people that might have left the labor force, what I do here is, again, controlling for age, education, and occupation, look at the change in non-participation relative, again, to the average in 2019, again, by family status. So we can compare people with children, without children, married and unmarried. And so what you see here is that even controlling for occupation, age, and education, you do still see that single mothers compared to single fathers have much higher incidence of a rise in non-participation. And then we also see that married mothers in the second part of 2020 see a bigger rise in non-participation compared to married fathers. And then the next step to sort of understand this better is, where does this rise in non-participation come from? So here I'm showing you two flows into non-participation. the employment to non-participation flow on the left, which basically are quits, people who had a job and decided to quit it, maybe because they had children that they needed to take care of. And on the right, the unemployment to non-participation flow, which is people who became unemployed and then decided to stop looking for a job. And you can see that there are no gender differences in the employment to non-participation flow, whereas all the gender differences are from in the unemployment to non-participation flow. So the story that I get, from these results is that actually it was the decline in labor demand that was to some degree responsible for the decline in labor supply. So consistent with what Claudia found, the women, the mothers who were able to keep their jobs, then, they kept them the job through the pandemic despite all the challenges, whereas, the mothers who were laid off, were the ones who potentially exited the labor force. Now, just to conclude, let me just, because I'm running out of time, talk a little bit more about, participation going forward and put this more in a historical perspective. As Claudia pointed out, participation of women in the United States has been stagnated since the mid-90s. And though there's been a ton of work on the rise in participation, there has been very little work on understanding why women's participation hasn't continued to grow since the mid-90s, and there's still this very big gap between female and male participation for prime age people. And so I've done some work on this, and it turns out that in this longer run perspective, most of the discontinued rise in women's participation is coming from married women, and particularly married women who are married to college husbands or in general high-income husbands. So if we compare the trend in participation pre-95 to what we see post-1995, most of that flattening out is coming from these high-income women married to college husbands. And so the idea that I've pursued in my own work is actually that the rise in top earnings, particularly for men, is partly behind this. And this is also related to Claudia's greedy jobs, idea, which is, there's been sort of a negative wealth effect on wise participation in market hours coming from the rise in top earnings of men. And so because college women tend to be married to college husbands, college women actually have seen this slowdown in participation, despite the fact that they have accumulated, a lot of education and labor market experience. So in the broader context, the flattening of participation is coming mainly at the high end of the income and the education distribution, though during the pandemic, the loss in employment and the decline in participation is coming mainly from the low end of the wage and the income distribution. So let me just conclude here. Just to say that, looking forward, I think if we want to sort of think about participation beyond the pandemic, we need to think about this historical change in the trend in female participation. And from a macro perspective, female participation has been really important in terms of sustaining TFP growth and wage growth for women and men, as well as, strong recoveries of the aggregate employment, over the business cycle. And so it's going to be important to not just focus on the pandemic, but on this broader trend, going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stefania. That was great. The second discussant is Jane Olmsted-Rumsey.
Sorry, let me share now again, now that it's full screen. Okay.
That's good.
Great. Okay, so thanks so much for having me to discuss Claudia's excellent paper. First, to just summarize what this paper is, I would say it's a comprehensive review of women's labor market experiences during the pandemic. And sort of the biggest takeaway is that the paper revises the view that gender was kind of the most important cleavage in terms of labor market outcomes during the pandemic. Instead, she really points most importantly to the role of education, this discrepancy between college and non-college, but then also points out that, of course, occupation was an important cleavage as well, and that's related to Stefania's work. And then also points out that even on top of that, race can still explain some of the differences in labor market outcomes. And I think one important contribution of this paper relative to other papers I've seen is, many people are finding the statistical significance of race in terms of labor market outcomes. Claudia actually uses survey evidence to show that health may be a driver of this. So there are differences in reported health outcomes and also the propensity to be caring for someone who's sick during the pandemic by race, which could be one explanation for these racial differences. And I haven't really seen that coming out very strongly in other work. So I appreciate that as one big contribution. On the other hand, the final takeaway from the empirical part is that gender was in fact a strong predictor of the rise in caregiving time, and that women had a bigger increase than men in the amount of time that they spent on childcare and other caregiving responsibilities. And then in the final part of the paper, she gives a nice kind of forward-looking view of what the effects of this persistent work from home post-pandemic might be for women's participation, the types of jobs that women are able to take, and then also their pay and promotion as a result of this. So I have three main comments. The first of these is considering what is the right counterfactual for the female labor force participation rate. And then I'm also going to kind of add some more color and try and actually quantify what the potential long run effects of remote work might be, drawing on my own work. And then finally, I'm going to talk about why we should care that this was a she session relative to a man session. I'm grateful that Stefania showed actually some comparisons with previous recessions, even though we find that there are kind of minor gender differences in the pandemic relative to what we expected. This can still have major policy implications compared to the last few recessions. So Claudia already showed this figure 1 from the paper. What I want to do is just kind of zero in on this surge in female labor force participation that occurred prior to the pandemic. And what we're asking is really, should we draw a straight line here when we measure declines during the pandemic? Or should we draw a straight line, from mid 2019, or should we do something else? I think to answer that question, we need to understand what drove this surge. And in general, the fluctuations that have occurred in female labor force participation since basically the late 90s are more of a business cycle phenomena than anything related to a secular trend. So that's the fact that, basically female labor force participation rate leveled off in the late 90s. And now the fluctuations that we see are really just related to the business cycle. So to just starkly illustrate this idea that the reference month that you use to measure declines really matter, let's take April 2020 as an example. So if you use February 2020 as your reference month, you would measure a decline in the female labor force participation rate of 3.4 percentage points. If you instead compare to a year earlier, you would measure a decline of just 2 percentage points. So this reference month issue really does matter. And I'll point out that this series that I just showed is already seasonally adjusted. So it's not from a seasonal perspective that we would necessarily want to compare to a year earlier. It's really more, do we think that this surge was something kind of spurious, or that it would have continued had the pandemic not happened? So I identify in my discussion some features of this surge from July 2019 to February 2020. The first of these, as you just saw, is that this surge was part of a larger recovery of female labor force participation that began in late 2015 as the economy was, as the labor market in particular was finally recovering from the great financial crisis. The second feature is that this rise was sustained over 8 months. So basically what happened is that the rate rose a lot in July 2019, but rather than falling back, as we might expect if this was some sort of seasonal or statistical anomaly, we see that the rate actually stayed at that high level that it reached in July 2019 and actually continued to grow modestly, which again points in my eyes to the idea that maybe it wasn't some kind of anomalous rise that we should disregard. The third feature is that it was driven by employment rising, not unemployment. So these people that were entering the labor force, these women were actually finding jobs, which is a positive signal of their future labor market attachment as well. The fourth feature is that this was broad-based among different types of women. If you look at demographic subgroups, you see that participation rose within most subgroups, by education level, presence of children, occupations, etc. But it was highest among traditionally less attached or more marginally attached workers. And this is, I think, dovetails very nicely with the discussion from the previous paper about the Fed describing its employment mandate as broad-based. As the cycle goes on, Powell has pointed out that, the most marginalized workers enter later in the cycle, and that seems to be precisely what was happening during this period. These tended to be lower income, younger, people with kids, etc. Sorry, I had one more. So the last thing I wanted to note is just that already by January 2022, the labor force participation rate of women had already risen to 76%, despite this huge kind of displacement experienced by many people during the pandemic. The participation rate recovered to a higher level than it had been any time between 2009 and 2019, up until July 2019. Which again points to the fact that actually maybe trend labor force participation rate was very high absent the pandemic. So the last thing on this point is that I follow an analysis that Claudia suggests in the paper and just do it in a more formal regression setup. We're looking at basically 4 groups of women in this analysis. So you have new entrants in 2017 and 2019. So the group that we're interested in is really the new entrants in 2019. And we're comparing both of those 2 groups to their counterparts who are continuously employed and looking at the propensity to exit the labor force in the next year. What you see is that new entrants both in 2017 and 2019 are more likely to leave the labor force in the next year, reflecting just this greater marginal attachment of new entrants to the labor force. But both continuously employed and new entrants in 2019 were more likely to exit the labor force in the next 12 months because of the pandemic, essentially. But when we interact this new entrant status with the pandemic, we don't see any additional propensity of these 2019 new entrants to exit compared to their counterparts in 2017 once we account for the effect of the pandemic itself. So again, this is suggesting that these weren't super marginally unattached workers that were entering. They look actually pretty similar to entrants in 2017. Okay, so the second comment is about these long-run consequences of employment flexibility for women. Claudia has been a pioneer in pointing out the job characteristics and job types that are kind of amenable to women taking them or more hostile to women taking them because of women's caregiving responsibilities. And these greedy jobs that require a lot of, face time, long hours in the office or travel have been kind of one of the last big barriers to gender equality in the workforce. And she points out that this, if work from home arrangements persist, this might be very helpful in, closing the gender pay gap, allowing women to have more flexibility in the type of jobs that they take, et cetera. But she also offers the caveat that I think is well-founded that, what if only women continue to work from home and men go back to the office? What will be the implications of that? The reason that I think this fear is well-founded is because of some work that we did looking at time use data prior to the pandemic in this Alone et al. Paper that I'm on, where we found that despite the fact that men and women had basically similar ability to telecommute, women actually telecommuted 33% more. So women were taking up telecommuting at a higher rate, probably because they have higher caregiving responsibilities, and it's one way to kind of ease those. But in the latest survey data that we have on desired work from home post-pandemic, we see men and women reporting roughly equal desired work from home days, about 2.2 per week. So maybe the pandemic has shifted norms around take up of work from home, but really that remains to be seen because this is a survey that asks people what they would like to do, not observational data of what people are actually doing. So it kind of remains to be seen whether this caveat will come true or not. In terms of quantification, in some of my other work, we developed this model of household labor supply and then use that to simulate a pandemic and a regular recession and do some counterfactuals where we look at whether if these telecommuting arrangements persist, what will be the effect on women's labor supply and the gender pay gap. So what I want you to pay attention to here is the difference between the yellow line, which shows a persistently higher fraction of telecommuting jobs in the economy of 30%, compared to the green line, which shows a reversion to the pre-pandemic fraction of telecommuting jobs of 13%. And what you see is that the relative labor supply of married women compared to married men rises by about 2 percentage points according to the model. So this persistence of work from home allows women to work more and work longer hours. And this has implications for the gender pay gap in the model because human capital accumulation occurs in the model when you work. So this greater labor force attachment of women as a result of telecommuting jobs speeds the recovery of the gender wage gap, because one prediction of our model is that because more women than men leave the labor market during the pandemic, the gender wage gap widens. Again, the yellow line is showing what happens if telecommuting stays high. The gender wage gap closes more quickly. Whereas if we look at the green line, we would see actually a very, very slow recovery of the gender wage gap back to pre-pandemic levels. All right, and then my final comment is about policy implications of she sessions relative to man sessions. Even though gender differences are smaller than many of us feared, it's still, this recession still looks quite different in terms of the gender composition of job losses, and Stefania also pointed this out. I would say that there's kind of three main differences between she sessions and man sessions that policymakers should be aware of. The first of these is kind of a reason that policymakers may not care as much about she sessions as man sessions. And that is that if you randomly sample 1 million women to lose their jobs and 1 million men to lose their jobs, the drop in aggregate labor income would be smaller in a she session because women on average work fewer hours and are paid less. So the drop in aggregate labor income from a she session might be lower than from a man session. But how exactly that translates into aggregate demand depends on the ability of households to insure themselves against these drops in labor income. And as Stefania was pointing out, one important channel of insurance that households have is this family insurance mechanism that in typical man sessions, the secondary earner can increase their labor supply. But in a she session, the husband is often already working, and so there's no space for him to further increase his labor supply and offset the decline in his wife's income. And so households may actually be more constrained in she sessions because of the loss of this insurance channel, which might imply a greater efficacy of fiscal policy. And then the last point is about the speed of recoveries. So Stefania's work has shown that, in previous recessions, one important way that the economy has recovered is through increases in female labor force participation and female labor supply. But this might be less true in a she session. So at the micro level, when we estimate labor supply elasticities by gender, we see that female labor supply is more elastic than men's. So women are slower to return to the workforce when they lose a job. And this might mean that the speed of recovery from a she session is slower. Okay, and then this is just coming out of our model to illustrate this point about MPCs and the efficacy of fiscal policy in pandemic compared to regular recessions. So here we're just plotting the MPC out of an unexpected government transfer in our model. And what you can see is that both for singles and couples, MPCs are higher in pandemic recessions and remain elevated for longer than in a regular recession. So I'll conclude here. I think the paper is really a vital look at women's actual experiences with the benefit of hindsight, because there have been so many kind of doomsday predictions. It's really important to go back to the data and see what actually happened. And the main takeaway is that while most women remained at work, they did have to increase caregiving time substantially. And at the same time, there were several million women who lost their jobs. And as I just pointed out, it might take longer for them to get back to work, and they might have bigger penalties on their earnings. And we've also gained some policy lessons for future she sessions. What I want to end on is just kind of the big question that everyone in policy circles is grappling with at the moment, which is where will or where should labor force participation rates recover to? And when we think about that question, heterogeneity by gender may matter because the drivers of female labor force participation may be quite distinct from men's. And, there's this puzzle of why male labor force participation rates have been dropping. Similarly now for women, as Stefania pointed out, and I think that's just a really important question for future research.
Great. Thank you, Jane, and also Stefania and Claudia for those great presentations. We have a lot of hands up already, people eager to discuss more. I'm going to start with Bob Hall and then Betsy Stevenson. So Bob. You there, Bob?
Unmute. Thank you. Okay.
There you go. We got you.
Good. Thanks. Well, this is a great session. You're really penetrating the data in good ways. But there's one subject that's, I think, key to understanding this that didn't get mentioned by either discussant or by Claudia, and that is there was a huge reduction in work starting in April of 2020. But almost all those people that account for the reduction in work did not lose their jobs. And that has permeating effects when you're looking at the rest. For the snapback from the recession was vastly faster than from any other recession because workers were recalled to existing jobs instead of having to try and find other jobs. So there was a huge pulse in 1 month, April of 2020, which accounts for all of the bulge of unemployment that takes the form of not lost jobs, but just lost work. And then all the dynamics you see after that are dominated until that component, the temporary layoff component of unemployment was dissipated until around the early fall of 2021. So it's no longer an influence, but I would advocate everyone working in this area to pay close attention. It's everything. I think the work that's being done, especially the focus on participation, is appropriate because since these people became unemployed, they were still counted as participants. So there isn't a first order problem, but I think there's a lot of kind of second order issues. And you certainly should never talk about people losing their jobs. What they lost was their work.
Okay, we'll take a few questions and then go back to Claudia and Stefania and Jane. So Betsy and then Carolyn Hawksby.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. So my comment was, I wanted to talk about what's the right counterfactual. I will say Jane did such a good job discussing that there's not that much left for me to say. But I do think that really is such a crucial question. And the one thing I wanted to add to what Jane laid out was that if we looked at the job growth that happened between 2015 and 2019, it was very, very steep job growth in the service sector, in the types of jobs that women tend to hold. And, when we got to February 2020, we still had 1 million fewer jobs in the goods producing sector compared to when we started the 2008 recession. But we had added 15 to 16 million jobs in the service sector. And so job growth was occurring in a place that was where women tend to work. And the thing that I worry about a lot right now is we haven't had a full recovery in demand for services. But what if we go back to wanting the kinds of services we had in 2019 or 2018? Will we have the same number of workers available? And so, that a lot of that's going to hinge on how many women come back. And so one other aspect just on what's the right counterfactual is it's not even just was the end of 2019 seasonally adjusted the right counterfactual, or was projecting the growth rate we were seeing between 2017 and 2019 the right counterfactual, which means, there's even further to go. And I think that's just a really big question out there. And then one last point I wanted to make was, I hear what Bob Hall just said. People didn't lose their job, they lost work. But actually, Claudia, what you discussed with the childcare responsibilities, what I've seen in surveys that I've done is that people made other accommodations in which they reduced work that doesn't show up as employment. They may have turned down a promotion, they may have stopped training, they may have just put in slightly fewer hours. In a way, those kinds of effects on people's career paths, their jobs and their earnings, we haven't even fully begun to see. And what I saw surprised me in the data is that those kinds of effects were hitting men and women equally. And reflect the fact that men went into the pandemic way less satisfied than women with the amount of time they got to spend with their children. And actually, the upside of the pandemic for men, fathers, seemed to be that they liked all that extra time with their kids. And so there might have been a shock to preferences, which comes back to Jane's point about now that we have the opportunity to work from home some more, will men take more advantage of this than they did prior to the pandemic? And that will make a huge difference to the path of gender equality, the answer to that question.
Right. Thanks, Betsy. I'm sure Claudia will come back to that at the end. Next is Carolyn Hawksby, and then Austin Goolsby on deck.
First, thanks to Claudia for a great paper and to Stefania and Jane for great discussions. So my comment is pretty straightforward. I think it's great to look at labor force participation. It's great to look at employment. And of course, it's really important to look at caregiving during the pandemic. But as much of Claudia's work has shown, especially for college-educated women, there are career concerns associated with continuous employment and the degree of engagement in work. And part of what I'm interested in is whether women were more likely to be what I would call distracted workers during the pandemic because they were trying to multitask and do childcare and maybe some homeschooling along with work. And if they were more likely to, let's say, participate in a Zoom call, but be on the phone or have their camera off the whole time, or if they were having to take breaks in order to see to a child who was, being very distracting in the room that they were trying to use, as opposed to, say, the male in the family who might not have had the kids in the room with him. And if they were simply being less productive because they were having to do so many things at the same time, those could have long-term effects, even though they were participating the entire time and even though they were employed potentially the entire time. And I would think especially for college-educated women where those sorts of engagement and career concerns can be a big deal. So I'd like to hear Claudia's or Jane's or Stefania's comments on that. Thanks.
Thanks, Carolyn. Austin Goolsby, and then Steve Davis.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I unmuted. Okay.
Yes.
I thought two things. One was related to what Caroline just said. Interestingly, productivity in most of these sectors, at least a rule of approximate rule of thumb of productivity, is that productivity went up in the pandemic. So overall, real GDP's up several percent from before the pandemic, and the labor force is not back to where it was before. So the just loose labor productivity for the whole economy is up 4 or 5% versus pre-pandemic. And in a lot of the service sectors, Chad Severson and I have looked at restaurants. Restaurant productivity went up. A lot of the service sectors went up. So it's interesting that in a way that hasn't been reflected in the wages. But the second thing that Claudia, the results seem to emphasize, let's call it the difference between the aggregate and the cross section. So there was that piece by Furman, Carney, and Powell, which said you can see the effect of childcare on labor force participation, but it doesn't contribute to the aggregate nearly as much as you would think just looking at the numbers. because one group seemed to be replacing the other group. And I do wonder, now that we're in a market of extreme labor scarcity, is it the case that you see this kind of substitution, that it's employers hiring women without children ahead of women with children because they have the higher childcare responsibilities? Or if you compared across industries where at the pre-pandemic, men and women are in the industry equally, does it look like there's substitution away from women toward men in those industries? I think that would be kind of fascinating, and kind of fascinating to look at the issue of the child penalty. So is it the case that women with small kids are falling behind, that the penalty for having a kid in some sense is getting bigger, precisely because they can't go back to work at that moment?
Good. And the next question I have is from Steve Davis.
Yeah, thanks. A few comments. First, to Bob Hall's point, I just want to add to what he said. There was a huge burst of temporary layoff unemployment. There was also a huge atypical exit from the labor force. So many people went from employment to non-employment or non-participation. Those people weren't on temporary layoff recall, and they've had a much longer path back. Second, there's an undertone of concern in much of the discussion about what higher rates of working from home might mean for women and their career prospects. And I get all that, but it's also worth remembering, when you ask people, which we do regularly in our survey of working arrangements and attitudes, would you like to work from home? Many of them, not all of them, say they would like to do so part of the time. When you ask them, well, how would you view it in terms of an equivalent? How would you view the option to work from home 2 or 3 days a week to an equivalent pay increase? The means range from about 5 to 8% of earnings. That's a big, big number. You also see that when you ask people, if your employer says you must come back to the office 5 days a week, what will you do? 40% of them say they'll look for another job that offers the ability to work remotely. So I do think we want to keep in mind that despite misgivings or concerns we might have, many people, maybe most people, have a strong desire to work from home, to have that flexibility to do it part of the time. And then to Betsy's point, we also ask men and women, what their employers told them about what their long-term working arrangements will be after the pandemic's over. And there we see that men will do more working from home than women, which you might say, okay, that's great. But the fact is, the other take on it is the gap between what people want and what they'll get in terms of the option to work from home is bigger for women than for men. So I just would encourage a little bit of maybe more thinking about the upside of the flexibility that comes with working from home.
Okay, thanks, Steve. We had a couple of late entries, so I'm going to ask Olivier Blanchard and Bob Gordon, starting with Olivier, but with short questions so we can get back to the author and discussants.
Short and predictable question coming from me, which is differences across countries might help a lot in identifying things. I mean, if I think about France, there was free childcare, which clearly must make a difference. We kept the schools open throughout, and we had an explicit partial employment system in which people could basically decrease the number of hours. It seems to me that each of these factors should have implications for what happened to the participation rates of women. So I know that that's much beyond what Claudia can do, but to the extent that she knows anything about it, it would be great.
Good, thanks. And last question from Bob Gordon. You there, Bob?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, two comments. One is further international perspective on Bob Hall's comment that we lost work, not jobs. If you compare Europe to the United States, you see that we lost a lot of jobs, and the federal government expenditures were on unemployment compensation, whereas in Europe, there were central government subsidies for people to keep their jobs and just work less. So this contrast between working less and job loss is much greater in between Europe and the US, suggesting there was a lot of job loss in the US. There's been a mention about productivity, and Austin mentioned restaurants. I've got a data set now for industry differences in productivity during the pandemic. And what is really noticeable is there's a huge difference if you look at the service sector, which is 2/3 of the economy, between what I call contact services, which are those which involve close contact, and those where people could work at home. And we have had a huge differential between an increase in productivity in work at home versus a decline in productivity in contact services. And I'd like to relate this to the work of Nick Bloom and Steve Davis, which has shown that to some extent, there is an explanation for the increased productivity of work at home, because according to what I've heard from Nick, we've had people's commute time has been substituted for work time rather than at home leisure time. And so assuming the BLS is not measuring this increase in hours per job, that suggests that some of the increase in productivity of at-home work may be a measurement issue. And I think this is worth pursuing. None of this relates to men versus women, I would admit.
Right. Thanks, Bob. Great point. So lots of good comments from the floor. Let me turn it back over to Claudia. And
Sure.
You can pick and choose what you want to respond to,
Yeah,
Claudia.
and I'm going to do this very quickly because this is all for the future. So first of all, I thank the editors and I thank Stefania and Jane for not just excellent comments now, but they improved the paper in the background, which no one has seen. So let me begin with various comments to begin with Bob's comment. In many ways, hidden in the paper and in the comments given is exactly what you're referring to, because the non-employment numbers are including the ones, that's why we call it at work, are including those who had jobs but were not currently at work. And so that was sort of built in to what I did and what many people did during the pandemic. The second point raised by various people, begun by Caroline, is the notion of the distracted workers. Very important questions about long-term issues. There are a couple of interesting papers. I cite some of them. For example, we academics, we have very good information that we produce, which is our working papers. They're leading indicators of where we're going to be later. And it is distressing and disturbing that women, particularly those with caregiving responsibilities, have produced fewer working papers. So, I hate to say that terrible times lead to more research, but it's pretty clear that that there's going to be a lot of interesting research in the future about what the long-term implications have been. The other point, which has been raised by various people, has to do with productivity changes. Implicit perhaps in what they've said is that in some of the service sectors, there has been changes in automation, certainly in restaurant ordering, in checking out, even going to the doctor, the veterinarian. There are fewer people who are taking your credit card, you just put it in. So there have been interesting changes in terms of automation. That doesn't get to Bob Gordon's point that in fact those areas have not seen the greatest increases in productivity, maybe in the future. So with that, I turn it over to others, but thanks very much to everyone and to Olivier Blanchard. I will go to France and I will do my research there. Thanks.
I'm glad we sparked that, Claudia. And Jane and Stefania, do you want to each take a minute or less and hit your highlights in response to the discussion?
I just wanted to follow up on Betsy's comment, which I thought was very interesting. So she mentioned that, after the Great Recession, effectively manufacturing jobs didn't fully recover, and we saw a big growth of service jobs, and those jobs were taken by women. And this has been like a constant of recent recessions. So it was the case in the 1991 recession and 2000 recession. So in some level, manufacturing jobs do not recover. Those primarily employ men, and then in the recovery we see a growth in service jobs. And so with respect to this particular pandemic, going back to the issue of automation, so one of the ideas behind the lack of recovery of manufacturing jobs in past recession was that when the economy recovers, firms adopt labor savings technologies, and so they don't hire back the workers, and that service jobs are less susceptible to this because they're care jobs for the most part. So in our paper, we looked at the susceptibility to automation of these occupations that were most hit by the pandemic, and about 33% of workers in the occupations that were most hit by the pandemic, mainly service occupations, are in positions that are highly susceptible to automation. And that's actually very similar to the susceptibility to automation of in the occupations and industries that are usually hit by a recession, so manufacturing, construction, and so on. So that sort of going forward, we might see some of the dynamics that we saw in past recessions for manufacturing jobs may be translated in service occupations as well.
Jane, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, just very quickly, I wanted to touch on Steve's comments that, people value a lot work from home, and they're reporting that they're going to, move jobs to look for more flexible arrangements. I'm definitely very sympathetic to that, and I've seen that in many surveys too, but actually the experience of kind of doing this work made me a bit mistrustful of what people report versus what people do, because a lot of these headlines that Claudia showed in the beginning of women saying, I'm going to leave the workforce, I'm going to completely scale back, I'm not going to seek a promotion. Actually, a lot of that didn't come to fruition. So it's almost like people express this kind of like pain or dissatisfaction in these surveys, but then their behavior can look very different. So again, like we may see, one thing I wanted to do was talk about the Great Resignation and quits and what are the drivers of quits. Is it really more flexible arrangements? But that data is not really available yet by gender. But I just think we need to at times be mindful of differences between what people express they're going to do versus what people actually do.
Great. Thank you, Jane and Stefania and Claudia. That was a terrific session, and also all the comments from the floor. We'll take a break now and come back at 3:40 with the decentralized finance paper.